Are you feeling called in the ministry? Hey, welcome to The Whole Truth, where I am taking you through the entire Bible, and I almost fall out of my rolly chair when I come into these videos. So there's that. Grab your Bible and go to Deuteronomy chapter 18 and find verse 1. Now, to be certain, we are dealing with God speaking to Moses, to ancient Israel. Some people love to get on my videos on YouTube and you like to put these little comments, say, God's not talking to you there, he's talking to. That's the context. That is the historical context. Absolutely, God is speaking to those people. But he is also speaking to you, and he is speaking to me. That's how one of the ways that we hear from God is through his written word. We hear from God through his spoken word. We hear from God through his written word. And then he even speaks in our hearts in his unspoken word through his spirit. So God speaks to us in multiple ways, and through his word is one of them. And today's an example of that. The passage and the context is 100% yes. It is about God talking to ancient Israel and telling them, here is what you do for the Levite people. Here's the portion for the Levites and for the priest. But we can find application. We can read this and God can speak to our hearts and he can draw us unto himself. And maybe that's you today. Maybe he's drawing you unto himself. So we're going to talk a little bit today about my call into the ministry, but also what that means if you're feeling called into the ministry. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 18, and we're going to read 8 verses. Let's start in verse 1. The priest, the Levites, all the tribe of Levi shall have no part nor inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the offerings of the Lord made by fire, and his portion. Therefore they shall have no inheritance among their brethren. The Lord is their inheritance, as he said to them. And this shall be the priest's due from the people, from those who offer a sacrifice, whether it is a bull or a sheep. They shall give to the priest the shoulder, the cheek, and the stomach, the first fruits of your grain and your new wine and your oil, and the first of the fleece of your sheep you shall give him, for the Lord your God has chosen him out of all your tribes to stand to minister in the name of the Lord, him and his sons forever. So if a Levite comes from any of your gates, from where he dwells among all Israel, and comes with all the desire of his mind to the place which the Lord chooses, then he may serve in the name of the Lord his God, as all his brethren and Levites do, who stand there before the Lord. They shall have equal portions to eat, besides what comes from the sale of his inheritance. Okay, so here's the picture that you're given is when you come into Israel, okay, so God speaking to ancient Israel, he says when you come into the promised land, when you come in, the Levites get no inheritance. Now, don't let that confuse you with the end of that I just read that says from the sale of his inheritance. Well, wait a minute, which is it? Does he have no inheritance or does he have an inheritance? Understand the whole thing. The whole thing is right now, no one has an inheritance other than the inheritance that God is planning, but nobody has any land yet. Nobody's been gifted anything yet. What happens is Israel, the nation, the Hebrew people, are going to go into the promised land. The promised land is not this Garden of Eden that is set up with everything perfect and in place. There are cities that are there. There are gardens that are there, but people planted them. The Canaanite people planted them. And Israel is going to go in and they're going to conquer those people. And we've talked about this several times. Don't let that be a bother to your mind that the Israelite people are going in and conquering, because remember, them going in and conquering is a punishment to the Canaanite people who had been living, and the Philistines and others who were in that land, who had been living against God. They had been living in opposition to God. And God waited several hundred years, 400 years to be exact. God waited several hundred years before letting Israel go in, because he was letting the people, so to speak, have enough rope to hang themselves. The people, God said that he was waiting for their sin to be fulfilled. And once they get far enough, God's going to send in the judgment, and Israel is that judgment. So Israel's going to go in and conquer the land. When they get through conquering the land, then God is going to use Joshua, the leader at that time. So we've had Moses. Moses will, and we still have Moses in Deuteronomy. And Moses will pass the baton, if you will, to Joshua. Joshua will help the people to conquer the land. And then when they do conquer the land, it's going to be divided up. And when they divide up that land, no inheritance is going to be given to the Levite people. They are to be the priest and the helpers of the priest. So all of the priests have to come from the line of Aaron, and Aaron is a Levite. So all of the priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. So all of the priests are Levites, but not all the Levites are priests. And so that means that some of the Levites are helpers to the priests, and they don't get any land divided up to them. But they're still people. There are female Levites. What do you do with all of the wives of the Levite people? They're still Levites too, right? But they're not helpers to the priest, and they're not priests. And then you have children as well. And then of course those people can buy things, and they can sell things, and they can trade for things, and life is going to go on for several hundred years. And what you will end up with is some Levite people will not be working in the tabernacle. And so just as you have some priests who are Levites, but not all Levites are priests, you are also going to have all of these people who are Levites. All the people who can help at the tabernacle with the priest have to be Levites, but not all Levites have to go and help at the tabernacle. So as people buy individual property, and as they have their own houses or whatever it might be, then you'll have Levites who are mixed in with the cities. But the city itself, you will not have a city that is the city of Levi. You won't have that. But the individual person could certainly own a house or own something. And here's what could happen. That person then may decide, and you get to this towards the end of what we just read in the last couple of verses, starting in verse 6, that person could be called by God to come into the priesthood. They could be called to come into the servitude, to come in and serve at the tabernacle. And if they feel called by God and they go into a certain city to serve in the tabernacle, or to serve in the temple, or to come in and serve where God, as to the priest, and to minister to the people, if they're going to do that, they would have to sell their inheritance to then come in and to do that. And here would be their portion. So for the priest and the Levites, everybody gets an equal portion of the shoulder and the cheeks and the stomach and the grain offering and the new wine and the oil. So do you see what they get? They get grain. So flour, they get barley flour, and they get wheat flour. They get flour and they get grain. Corn is in there. They get grain, and they get oil, and they get wine. Those things that are used in the offerings. When the Israelite people would come to make the offering, the priests and the Levites would stand in the way to minister with the people, to minister for the people. That's how it went. When God wanted to speak to man, prophet. But when man needed to get to God, he needed a priest. God assigned these priests, and he told them how to do it. The people would come, they would bring their offering, and that offering would go to the priest and to the Levites. And so they would get meat, shoulder and cheek and stomach, and they would get grain and wine and oil. So their needs are now being provided for. Okay, that's the context. That's what would happen in the ancient world. And that's how, when God called them and they would go into that servitude, then now they would give up all inheritance, anything they had bought, anything that they had before, and they would come in to be a Levite, and they would get an equal portion of what all the other Levites and all of the other priests are surviving off of. That would be divided equally between all of them, and God would call them to that position. Now, what does that mean for you and I? Well, let's talk. I know I'm a few minutes into this video, but I want to talk about being called by God, because these Levite people, God says that he calls them. And the first thing you have to understand is this: if you're being called into the ministry, then you need to understand that God is calling you to give up certain things in life. You cannot have one foot in the world and one foot in the corporate world and one foot in the pastorate, one foot in the ministry. Now, there are times that God utilizes what you're doing, and he utilizes that for ministry. But friends, don't try to manipulate that. You can't do that. I've seen this illustration with a pastor climbing up on two ladders. He's got one ladder on one side and one ladder on the other side. And he's climbing up. And at first where the ladders are touching at the bottom, he's climbing up easily, but he only gets a few rungs up before all of a sudden his legs are getting further apart and further apart and further apart. And he makes the point, he says, you can only go so far with one foot in the world and one foot in Christ. And I would say the truth is this, that same truth is for the ministry. You can only go so far. If God is truly calling you in the ministry, you have to be willing to give up all of whatever you were already doing. Do you know what the Apostle Paul said? Now, the Apostle Paul, before he was the Apostle Paul, was a Pharisee. He was learned in the Jewish religion. And do you know what a Pharisee said of all that he had done before? He said he counted it all of his accolades. He was a Jew of Jew. He was in the tribe of Benjamin. He had been in the school of Gamaliel. He was a scholarly Jew. And he said, you know, all of those things that I did before, I count them all as dung. I count them as nothing. Are you willing to give up your earthly accomplishments? Are you willing to give up your earthly desires? Are you willing to give up your earthly accolades? Are you willing to give up what you already have collected to go and serve God? Because that's what God calls us to in the ministry, is to say, Lord, you are my inheritance. Jesus said it this way: don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust can destroy and thieves can break through and steal. Don't lay up for yourselves those treasures. Where should you lay up your treasures? Lay up your treasures in heaven. What did God say of the Levite people? He said, God will be their inheritance. If they give everything up to come to God, what are they doing? They're saying, God is going to be my inheritance. I don't want all of these earthly things. I want to please God. You see, if you're coming into the ministry, you need to be giving up whatever God's calling you to give up. I can't tell you the number of young men that I speak to that come to me and they say, Justin, I feel called into the ministry, but I have this great job. Are you called in the ministry? Are you willing to give up the great job to go do what God has called you to do? And I'm telling you so many times, it is, well, I can't give up the job. So what I was thinking I could do is fill in the blank. Friends, this takes me to my second point. If you're going to come in the ministry, you have to accept what God is giving you. You know, there are times that you're in the ministry and the portion that God has given you is bivocation. I was bivocational for years. I had two full-time jobs. I owned a business and I ran an upholstery store with my family, and I pastored the church. Believe it or not, I did that for 13 years. Well, maybe not quite 13 by the time I was full-time, but a long time. 11 years before I was full-time, 11 years, over a decade. I did both, but I did both because I had to. I didn't have enough. There wasn't enough, if I could steal from this term, there wasn't enough shoulder and stomach and grain and wine and oil. There wasn't enough to provide for my family. I remember one time when the church had first started paying me, and they chose to do that. I didn't ask for that. The church first started paying me. And somebody came to me and they said, well, we're really bothered by the fact that now you're taking pay from the church. We're worried about where that could end. And I pointed out to them, I showed them a receipt from a recent grocery trip, and the pay that the church was giving me wasn't even enough to cover my groceries for the month. My monthly pay wasn't even enough money to cover my groceries for the month, because we just didn't have it yet. If God's calling you into that, you have to be willing to accept where he has you. You know, there was a time in Paul's life who counted everything else as dung, who counted everything else as worthless. He made tents during the day and he preached at night, and he did that for a time. And so maybe God's calling you to be bivocational, and you have to be willing to accept that. Maybe you have to be bivocational, but the thing that you're doing now that pays well or has a better prospect of the future, maybe you have to give that part of it up. That's part of that sacrifice that you have to give up. You have to be willing to take willing to accept the portion that God has given you. You should see here that the Levite people needed to live among everyone else. They needed to live like everyone else. That is the truth for you and I. Pastors and teachers and those in the ministry should not live above everyone else, but we should live among everyone else. And so it's not good to see pastors who are being paid so much money that they are living above everyone else. This past week, I was invited to go to this plane show and sell, and they had these private jets for sale. And we climbed on this jet, and we were just being silly. We were just touring these jets. We were being silly and took a picture. And sure enough, people got all bent out of shape. They got their undies in a twist, all because the pastor was on a private jet. Well, I can promise you I don't have enough money to buy a private jet. And even if I did, I wouldn't want to. I believe the pastors should live among the people, not above the people. We were just touring the jets because we were at the show. But that's beyond the point for a second. I think you get what I'm saying, that we have to accept what God is given to us. You see, when God called me into the ministry, when I'm saying yes to the ministry, I'm saying yes to whatever that is. I want to be like Abraham. I want to go to the land that God will show me. So if that's the mission field in some other country, then that's where I want to go. If that's to plant a church in your own hometown, then that's where you should go. If that's to teach a kids class, then that's what you should do. You've got to do what God's called you to do and accept what he's willing to give and what he does give you, because you understand that your inheritance is the Lord. He is now your inheritance. He's the one that you're seeking to please. So wherever he calls you, wherever he places you, that's what you do, because he's the one who's called you to do it. So if he's called you to do something that you don't want to do, maybe you're Jonah. Maybe he's calling you to go to a place you don't want to go to. That's where you should go. You shouldn't go because you don't want to go. You should go because you're called in the ministry and you're accepting your call wherever God would have you to go. And then you trust God that he's going to be the one to provide for you. You have to trust that he's going to be the one to take care of you. Sometimes that might mean by vocation. Sometimes that might mean that you have to give up that vocation because you don't have enough time. And that can be a hard and scary thing when you go, well, in my vocation, I've made so much money. I've done so well. I've done all of these things. And if I go into the ministry, sure, I can survive, but things are going to look different. Well, has God called you into the ministry? Things need to look different. For the Levite people, they would sell the stuff they had and go to where God had called them and then accept what the portion was in that area because they were called in the ministry. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope you'll come back tomorrow as we get a little further into Deuteronomy chapter 18. I'll see you then.